Hello, everybody. Good morning. Sweet. Awesome. So just to make sure y'all are awake, show of hands, how many of you like debugging? Okay, couple. Better question. Better question. How many of you have ever been frustrated while debugging? Yeah, all right, cool. Sweet. So if you raise your hand, you've come to the right place. If for some reason you didn't raise your hand on that second question, please come talk to me at the end of the session because I want to know how not to be frustrated. So my name is Leslie Richardson. I am a program manager on the Visual Studio debugging team. And in this talk, I'm going to share with you some tips and tricks for debugging in Visual Studio 2019. So because we're currently hanging out in Orlando, and hopefully all of you will be partying it up at Universal tonight for the after party, I want to talk about rides. Who likes rides? Right? Super fun. I love rides. Back when I was living here, I used to have an annual pass at Disney World, so I would ride rides all the time. So rides are fun because I love the adrenaline rush that I get when I'm on it. It's super thrilling, and then the moment I get off, I immediately want to get back on again. But there's usually something holding me back from time to time when it comes to getting back on the ride, and that's lines. Lines are not fun. True story, when the Hagrid ride opened up in Universal Studio back in like July, it was a 10-hour wait, which is absurd. Yeah, so lines aren't fun. They're long. If you're in Orlando, it's usually hot and humid and you feel gross. There might be a screaming child behind you, and you're spending more time in the line than you are on the actual ride. And at least for me, I question or not whether this was all worth it. Like, is that ride that I'm only going to get a 2-minute thrill from worth waiting in this crazy, frustrating line? And I feel like this experience can be very similar to debugging sometimes, where you spend a lot of time trying to figure out what's going wrong in your code. You spend more time debugging that issue than you do actually writing new code. And ultimately, you just want to get to that thrill that you feel when you finally see your code up and running properly. So in this session, my job is to hopefully share with you some tools that can help make that debugging experience a better one so that you can quickly get to the excitement of seeing your code in action. And with that, I'm going to head right into demo territory because there's a lot to cover. So for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to be using the latest version of Visual Studio 2019. This is 16.4 Preview 3, which just came out a few days ago, so you can go download it immediately after this talk if you haven't already. And I will primarily be focusing on the .NET side of things, but most of the tools that I'm going to talk about are relevant to C++ as well, unless I state otherwise, so no sweat. And oh, yeah, and all these tools are currently available in the community version, except for like one, and I will point it out when I get to it. So you can try out any of these right now, no matter what version of Visual Studio that you have. So in this demo, I'm going to primarily be using an ASP.NET Core 3 application that will randomly give me a list of books that I can either choose to read or choose not to read. And while that's all well and good, I love to read. Unfortunately, this app has several bugs strewn throughout it, so we're going to use Visual Studio in order to figure some of them out. So I already have a breakpoint set in my book manager constructor here, and this is a constructor that's taking in a JSON file containing all of this app's book info, converts each of those elements into a book object, and then stores each of those book objects into a list called books. And that's actually the first variable that I would like to take a look at. So I'm currently at the start of my application, but I really need to go to the end of this method here in order to see books filled up. So obviously I could start stepping through, no problem, but this could take some time, especially once I hit this for loop, and I could be here for who knows long, so that's not really fun at all. So as an alternative, I can use a tool called run to click. And to use that, I can hover over to the line I want to run my code execution up to, and then there'll be a little green glyph icon that you might have seen before once or twice. And from here, I can run all of my code up to that given point. So this is cool because it's like having a remote control for your application if you just want to fast forward through wherever you want to go. This is the way to do it. And from there, I'm going to go ahead and pin the data tip associated with this books list, which I can do by selecting the pin icon here, and that will persist the data tip across all my sessions until I choose to close it. So if I wanted to inspect all of my books right off the bat, at first glance, this view is not the most helpful. Like if I wanted to identify each book by its title property, for instance, I'd have to expand each of these out until I found the title. It turns out that's not the right one, and then rinse and repeat, in this case, like 100 more times. So that's not great at all. I'd like to get something more specific than just the type of object, which I already know is going to be a book. So there's a couple options that we have available to us. The first is you can override your class's toString method, but if you want to have that separation between strings that are displayed in your app versus strings that are just being displayed in your debugging windows, then that may not be something that you want to do. So another option that we have are these two attributes that have existed in C# and C++ respectively for a while now. One is called Debugger Display for C#, the other is called mapviz for C++. And these are attributes that when you, in Debugger Display's case, either add some related syntax to the top of your class definition, or in mapviz's case, if you modify a file, will allow you to customize what's being displayed in like the value column of your locals window or data tip. So these are all well and good, especially if you want to do more advanced type of viewing experiences, but the downside to this is you need to modify your code to do this, so you may not want to do that depending on who you are and what your project is. You have to stop debugging in order to use it if you didn't set this up beforehand. And 3, how many of you have actually heard of either of those features? Okay, a couple, yeah. So it's not the most discoverable or well-known feature either. So if you're not actively seeking it out, good luck trying to find it. So based off of all that, and after talking with lots of developers such as yourselves, we've created a new tool available for Preview 3.16.4 called Pinnable Properties, which allow you to do that same behavior, but at debug time. So if I expand out my books list under the locals window here, and I can also do this in watch, autos, or data tips, I can expand this out, and then in my property list here, I'm going to identify each book by their title. You'll notice a little pin icon will now pop up when you hover over, and when I do that, I can just pin the property, which will be bubbled up to the top of the list, and as you can see, there's all of the awesome properties just right there front and center. Yeah. So it's super cool. It's my new favorite feature. It used to be Debugger Display, but I think this is cooler. So in addition to that, you can pin multiple properties, and all of these will persist across all your debugging sessions, so you can close this out and come back to it, and they'll all be here until you decide to unpin them. And as an added bonus, if you don't want to see the name of the property, you can hide it or show it, depending on what you'd like. And if for some reason you just want to view only the objects that are, or the properties that are currently pinned, then you can filter out the other ones, and it'll just show you the ones that you have pinned. So this is really great, and as you can see, this also applies for data tips as well, so I can see the same view. All right, so from there, the next thing that I would like to inspect is a variable that's up here. It's a JSON string. It's taking in all the JSON file information initially. But the problem is I'm currently out of scope from it at the moment because I've reached the end of this function. So instead of having to start my debugging session all over again in order to get back to that place, I can actually use another tool called setToNextStatement, which allows me to choose the next line of code that I want executed. So to do that, I can either drag this execution pointer up to the line that I want, or I can right-click on the line that I want and then go to setNextStatement. And there it is. And this is really great if you just want to go back and quickly reinspect something before you close out and all that jazz. Or if you know that you have a block of code that contains a bug, you could use it to skip over that block. But you kind of have to use this at your own risk. So user discretion is advised because this is not the same as rewinding, or if you're familiar with time travel debugging, it's not the same as pretending that all the other lines of code didn't ever get executed. You're simply choosing the next line of code that you want executed, or in this case, re-executed. So depending on what your code is and where you're using this tool, this could easily mess up your code flow and you'll have to start a new session anyway. But in this case, it's totally cool. So from there, if I examine this JSON string, it's not the most legible thing at first glance. It's all cutting off the page, all the formatting for JSON is lost, and it's not really useful. So to fix this, I can use one of the text visualizers that Visual Studio has by default. So there's a magnifying glass icon next to this line, also goes for data tips. I can expand this out and I'll get a drop down of different text visualizers that I can use. So If I wanted to view my text in its proper XML format, I could do that, or HTML, but in this case, I'm going to choose JSON. And as you can see, it's a lot more readable that way, with the added bonus of I could filter things down, so if I just wanted to view pages, I could see all that too. So that's really great, or if you just have like a large block of text that's cutting off the page and you want to see it all in a more manageable format, then you can just use the basic text visualizer and see that too. And also, if you want to get more custom with it, like let's say you want to view tables and stuff, there is a dataset visualizer that's available, as well as just other ways to customize your own visualizer tools, which I won't get into here, but it is possible. All right, and at that point, I've done everything I want to do at this area, so now I'm just gonna go ahead and get into the app itself and try to figure out what's going on with the rest of it. But just to recap, those were Pinnable Properties, which allow you to bubble up your properties to the top of a debugger display. There are pin data tips, which allow you to persist a data tip across multiple sessions. You also have set to next statement, which allows you to choose the next line of code that you want to have executed next. And you have run to click, which allows you to fast forward through all of your code's execution to the line that you want. All right. So as I mentioned before, this is just a basic book recommendation app. It's .NET Core 3, and it can randomly give me a list of books that I can either choose to read or not to read. That is the question. So at this point, the first issue that I'm having is about adding all of these books to my shelf. So any book that could be recommended to me will be added to my shelf by default. But I'm noticing that as I scroll through, it looks like not all the books that I'm expecting to see are visible, even though it looks like it worked at first glance. So I'm thinking about half of the books are missing. So I'm going to go into Visual Studio and try to figure out what's up. So I'm going to navigate to my Add All to Shelf function, and this is a function that is responsible for adding all the books to my shelf. So at this point, I would like to test my theory about only half the books being displayed by seeing how many index values are occurring before this for loop here stops. So normally this would be the time where my old self would put print statements everywhere. Who likes print statements? Yeah, all right, cool. I love them. Before I got introduced to the debugger, they would be all throughout my code. Half the time I'd forget to delete them afterward. Lots of fun. And then you have to modify your code to do it. So if you were in a session, you have to stop and start repeatedly and keep adding and deleting later. So if you like having print statements, but you don't like having to modify your code to do so, then another alternative is something called a trace point, which lets you do that same thing, but you don't have to modify your code. So I can set a basic breakpoint on the first line here, and I can hover over to get the settings icon that appears. Then I'll go into Actions, and from there I get a prompt telling me to display a message on the output window. So in this case, I would like to print out all the index values of this loop. So I'm going to do index : and then I in curly brackets, which returns the value of a variable that I specify. And I'm leaving continue code execution checked because otherwise my code would be halted every time this trace point gets triggered. And in my case, I'm actually going to restart from here, but the beauty about trace points is that you don't need to restart your code necessarily in order to use them. In my case, I'm just doing it because of the nature of this bug, but depending on what your code is, you can continue running the code as usual and repeat the same action that you were doing before in order to get that trace point to happen. Okay, we're gonna keep going. And again, I'm gonna add all the books to my shelf. It might take a little longer this time just because it needs to print out all that info. And when I go into the output window, there they are. So it's like a print statement, except didn't have to add any code to use this. So this is one way to view trace points, but if you feel like there's too much going on in this window, which is totally understandable, another option is using the Diagnostics tools window, which is that window that you may have found yourself closing from time to time. I am also guilty of this. But my favorite part about this window is the Events tab here. And in this case, I can filter out events so that only the trace points are the ones appearing. So this is a nice other spot to see just the trace points in action if you want to view them that way as well. So at this point, it looks like my index values only go up to I equals 49. So as expected, it looks to be about half of the 100 books coming out. So at this point, I would like to go through that loop itself and just break it down a little bit further and inspect it some more. So I'm going to navigate back to, oh, not there. Yeah, navigating back to this function again, I would like to step through this for loop, only I'm really more interested in finding out what happens toward the end of this for loop, so when I is equal to 49. And I really don't want to have to set a normal breakpoint here and step through from when I is equal to 0 to I is equal to 49. Chances are I'll get distracted anyway and skip over, and then I'd have to repeat that process all over again. So I can use another breakpoint called a conditional breakpoint, which allows me to halt my code under a specified situation. So back where I set my trace point, I'm entering the settings again, and I'm going to uncheck actions, but keep in mind you can also have both a trace point and a conditional breakpoint at the same time if you want to do that. And checking conditions, I'm prompted to add a conditional expression. So in my case, I want to halt my code when I is equal to 49. And here's the conditional breakpoint. It's got a little plus inside the normal icon. And once again, I'm restarting just because of my bug and the nature of it, but you don't necessarily have to stop your code in order to use either of those. All right, so back again, adding all the books to my shelf. And here we are, this breakpoint hit. And you'll notice that when I hover over to get I's data type, it's set to 49 automatically. So I got to skip all of that tedium of starting from I equals 0 and just got to this point that I needed to be at. So from here, inspecting this for loop toward the end of its run, I'm noticing that I actually set my neutral books.count as part of my conditional statement, even though I'm also removing a neutral book by the end of each iteration, and I think that's what's causing only half the books to be displayed. So I can stop debugging, and to fix this, I'm going to comment that line out and just clear out all the neutral books after the loop is over. And that should solve the issue. So these two tools are really cool, but they also have their drawbacks. I know a lot of people talk about the performance setbacks that conditional breakpoints can have at times, depending on what you're using. So if you would like to share your feedback, I will be here at the end of the session as well, because we're currently working on making the trace point and conditional breakpoint experiences better. All right, and hopefully this time works. And I scroll down, and it looks like I'm getting a lot more books than I did before, so problem solved. So conditional breakpoints and trace points, two great alternatives to breakpoints in general, or if you want to keep the thrill of printing everything throughout your code, but you don't want to have to modify your code, then trace points are a good way to go as well. So the next bug I want to address revolves around when I finish a book. So after refreshing all of that, I'm going to choose to read this book called The Golden Notebook, which doesn't sound thrilling, but I'll give it a shot. And I'm going to click on it. And so for me, I tend to read the same book multiple times if I really like it. So every time I finish the book, I want it to tell me how many times I finished it. So this is already a bit of a red flag because it's telling me that I've read this book once already, even though I just added it to my shelf. But I'm going to say that I finished the book anyway. And when I click it again, I expect to see it say that I've read it twice, but now it's saying I've read it 4 times. So I definitely cannot read that fast with like 3 more times in 10 seconds. That would be really impressive, but I don't think I can. So there's probably something being changed in Visual Studio without my knowledge, and I want to go into the IDE to figure it out. So in my home controller file, I'm going to place a breakpoint at the end of this index function. This is associated with my home page, so I will just refresh the home page, which is my shelf. And at this point, I want to hone in on that specific book. So I'm going to use the new search tool that's available for 2019 in the locals, autos, and watch windows. And it was called Golden Notebook, so I'll just say Golden. And here we are. Saves a lot of time, especially if you have a lot of different elements that you're inspecting at once, or you have a large list, then use search to get there a little bit faster. And from there, I want to take a look at a property that this object has called timesRead. So this is the property that's responsible for being incremented every time I say that I finished the book. So I'm going to search for timesRead. And this time I get a notification telling me that no matches have been found, but it's also giving me the suggestion of changing my search depth to a larger number. So search depth allows me to choose how thorough I want my search to be. And the reason why we have this in the first place is because the way that this search is implemented, it's kind of like a depth-first search if you're familiar with trees. So it's going to go as far deep into the node as possible before popping back out and then rinse and repeat. So depending on what you have going on in the window, it could take a lot of time. So we wanted to give you the option to choose performance over how thorough your search is going to be. So in my case, I'm just going to bump up my search depth to 3, and that should get me to where I need to be. And here we are. And at this point, I think that times red is being changed in a place that I am unaware of, and I really don't want to play the trial and error game of determining where that location could be. So I can now use a breakpoint that's called a data breakpoint. This has existed in C++ for a while, but as of 2019 and .NET Core 3, it is available for managed users as well. So it's a breakpoint that will allow me to stop my code when a specific object's property changes, even if it goes out of scope. So to use it, I can right-click on that property and then select break when value changes. And I know it's been formed because I get the breakpoint icon next to that. I can go into the breakpoints window to double check, and there it is as well. And scrolling up, Visual Studio's added an object ID here, and this is how Visual Studio will be able to keep track of this object if it ever goes out of scope while my code is running. So in C++, the object ID is not really needed because the property is usually associated with an address somewhere. And from there, I'm going to hit continue, and hopefully I get some more useful info. And right off the bat, all I did was click on the book, and I got a notification telling me that my breakpoint was hit, which is already odd because I didn't even say that I finished the book in the first place. So in addition to that notification, I'm also given the previous value of this property as well as what the new value is, and I've been redirected automatically to the line where that change directly occurred. So in this case, it's happening in my property setter, and I'm more concerned about what actually called that setter last. So I can go into the call stack window and select the line or the frame right below it, and here we are. And it turns out times red is being incremented from the get shelled book method, which I don't want because I know times red is being incremented somewhere else. So I can comment that out, and that should fix the problem, and I'll just restart. So data breakpoints have been available for .NET Core for a while, but .NET Core 3 has been in preview for so long, it seems, but it's finally out of preview as of, I think, last month. So if you haven't tried it out yet, now's the time to do so. Okay, so repeating those same actions again, I'm going to read this thrilling book called The Trial. Very interesting book's being recommended to me today. And then I'm going to click it and say that I finished this book, and hopefully the next time I click it, it should tell me that I've read it once, and that's what I get. So those are data breakpoints. They're really nifty when you feel like you can address a problem by honing in on one specific object instead of using just a basic breakpoint, which could be hit by hundreds of your objects, depending on what you're doing. It's also great if you just don't want to play the trial and error game of determining where those changes are coming from. This is especially great if maybe you're new to a code base and you're experiencing an issue like this. You don't have to go through trial and error with code that you're not as familiar with at the moment if you use this tool. And of course, that was also search for the autos, locals, and watch windows. Both are 2019 exclusives. All right, so the next issue that I would like to address has to do with the line right above where it says one time. So I tend to read multiple books at the same time, and as a result, I can finish multiple books in the same day. So in addition to seeing the date, I would also like to know the specific time that I finished a book as well, which is currently not displayed. So I'm going to go into Visual Studio and set a breakpoint on the line associated with that string. And I just need to refresh to hit it again. And at this point, looking at this line, there's kind of a lot going on. We have a nested function call here. There's the outer function call. I don't know what viewBag.timeFinished is. There's a lot. So ultimately, I would like to break down this line piece by piece in order to determine what's going on at each step, and then hopefully figure out where I need to modify my code to add the time to that line. So the first thing I would like to inspect is this toString method here. But using the stepping tools that are already given to me, so step in, to step out, and step over, it may not be the easiest thing to do because I don't really get to choose what I want to step into first. So luckily, there's another option called step into specific, which performs a step into, except I can choose which method I want to go into first. So to do that, I can right-click this line and then go to step into specific. And here I'll get a drop-down containing all the different methods that I can go into first. And I'm going to choose toString. And here we are, just performed a basic step into again. And this one's pretty simple. It's just returning my name in this case, so I'm going to step through this, step back out. And from there, I want to take a look at this finish toString method. So once again, I'm going to use step into specific and then go to finish toString. And at this point, I've got some string concatenation going on here. So I would like to examine the return value of this method. Only problem is I didn't set this to an arbitrary variable at first. So at first glance, it looks like it might be difficult to determine this without stopping my session and doing that. But luckily, if you actually step to the end of your method and go into the locals or the autos windows, you'll notice that there is a return keyword that automatically pops up once you reach the end of a method. And this is how you can view your return value without having to stop and start or set this to a variable. So this is really great. I like this keyword a lot. Another option to view the same result is in the watch window. You can double click and do $ return value to get the same result. And at this point, what's cool about doing this in the watch window especially is that now you can add format specifiers to this. And format specifiers are just additional ways to customize what's being displayed in this window. So if you add a comma, which indicates that you're going to add a format specifier, in 2019 you'll get this nice drop down giving you a list of different format specifiers that you can use. So if I had like an int variable and I wanted to view it in hexadecimal, then I can use (h). Or in this case, if I wanted to remove the quotation marks around the string, then I could use (NQ), which is a string with no quotes. And voila, there it is. So these are really cool. There's a whole chart of them that are available online that I recommend you experiment with because they're cool. C++ in particular has some really cool format specifiers that are unique to C++, such as the ability to take an error code and it will convert it to something that's easy for a human to understand. So check those out. And at this point, I want to finally step into this finish book string method here. But since I've reached the end of my method, it looks like I might have to restart. But luckily, I can use that set to next statement feature that I noticed earlier, that I talked about earlier. And from there, I can step into there. And here we are, hopefully at the last method that I need to go into. And I've got more string concatenation, but luckily I can go to the end, and here's return value in action. And at this point, I'm noticing this toShortDateString method call that I think is what's causing the time to be omitted. So I can just delete that, and that should add the time. So at this point, because I modified my code, I might need to stop debugging and restart and create a new session. But actually, in this circumstance, I can use a tool called Edit and Continue, which allows me to modify my code without having to start a new session. So I can hit Continue. And here we are. So in that case, Visual Studio just went ahead and recompiled that code for me. So this doesn't work under every scenario. In the cases where you're doing something that involves like redefining a method signature or a class, it's not going to let you do it. But for little things like that, it should work out. So try it out. And at this point, I just need to refresh that page. And I don't need this breakpoint anymore, so I'll hit Continue. And here's the time. So that was a lot of different tools, but there was a step into specific, set to next statement made a reappearance as well as the return keywords for the locals and autos windows, and return value, as well as format specifiers in order to further customize what you're inspecting. So at this point, I fixed all the bugs in this version of my app. Yay, so exciting. Finally, it's working as it should. But I also heard about that cool programming thing that's all the rage these days called asynchronous programming. So I went ahead and modified a lot of this code so that it's asynchronous. So I'm going to switch over to my async branch and stash my changes. And unfortunately, while I was in the process of converting all of this code, I created another bug, as I think we've all been there when you're trying to like overhaul your code and then you add in additional bugs accidentally, which are always fun. Might take a minute. The suspense. Here we go. So I'm now at my rate books page again, and the problem once again lies with when I finish a book. So I'm going to say that I've read the book, go into my shelf, say that I finished the book. No problem there, but when I click it again, I get the lovely browser exception. Who's seen this before? Yeah, not great. So what my expectation was is I wanted to be redirected to Visual Studio and see that trusty exception helper that tells me the exact line of code where that exception was thrown from, but I'm not getting it here. So let's go into Visual Studio and try to address this. So there's two ways that I think you can view your exceptions when you get an error like that. The first is with the Diagnostics tools window. Yet again, I can filter out exceptions. Oh, exception. Whoops. Here we go. And you'll notice that there's a red diamond here with like a tiny little camera icon that might be a little hard to see. But this is one way to view the exception within Visual Studio. And if you have IntelliTrace enabled, which is exclusive to Enterprise, so this is like the one feature that you need to have Enterprise for in order to use, you can double click this and you'll be redirected to the exact moment in time where this exception was thrown from. So you get a notification telling you that you're in historical debugging mode. That's because this was something that happened in the past. So this is really cool because it's what is happening here is when that exception gets thrown, Visual Studio will take a snapshot or a picture of the state of your application in that given moment. And by double clicking this exception, I can load up that image and view what was happening at that time, as well as utilize the locals autos, watch windows, and all the other debugging tools that I've come to know and love in the present. So if you don't have Enterprise, no sweat. Another option that you can use is by going into exception settings here. And here there's a drop down of a bunch of different exception categories that you can use. So in my case, I got a runtime exception, so I'm gonna check this entire category here. So next time that a runtime exception of any kind occurs in my app, I will be notified about it by default. So from here, I'm going to hit continue, and I'm just gonna refresh this page just to show you. And there's the exception helper that I wanted to see. So this is really great if you like to have that experience. You can go in and just check whatever categories of exceptions that you care about. The downside to this is that this can make your debugging experience very noisy really fast if you don't narrow it down further. So in this case, because I checked off an entire category, I'm going to be notified about every single runtime exception that ever happens throughout my code, which I may not want. So if you don't want that, and you're familiar with the exceptions that you do care about, then make sure to expand this out and just check the exceptions that you do want to see. All right, so at this point, I now have just kind of like a lightning talk of all the additional tools that I just haven't talked about that I'd like to share with you. So as I mentioned before, this is async code, and async, while it's cool and can do a lot from like a throughput standpoint, it may not be the easiest to understand, particularly when you're debugging. Visual Studio likes to hide a lot of the nitty-gritty details associated with asynchronous code nowadays, and that may not necessarily be what you want. For instance, if you go into the call stack and try to step through some async code, usually you might see a disabled looking string of text that just says async code. Okay, what about it? So that's not very useful. So we have a tool that has existed for a while called the Parallel Stacks tool. And this is a tool that lets you visualize your tasks and what the status of each one is, whether they're active or awaiting. This tool also exists for threads, so if you have multi-threaded applications, then chances are you've probably already been using this in order to visualize the same sort of deal. So with tasks, we've overhauled a lot of it because before you couldn't really view a tabular version of the tasks from this window, and you also didn't have an individual call stack for each task. as circled there below. And that's pretty nifty. All right, and then the next tool has to do with Docker containers. So if your boss has ever told you to convert something to a Docker container because containers are awesome, then it's really easy to do in Visual Studio. You can just right-click on a project, go to Add, and then select Docker support, and then you'll choose which target OS that you want. So from there, if you ever need to debug a container, in this case a Linux Docker container, either on a local machine or a remote machine, then you can just go to Debug, followed by Attach to Process. And new for, I want to say 16.3, it's still in preview, but we now have the ability to select a Docker connection type. So if you're familiar with this window, whether it's because you tend to remote debug a lot or you've just seen it before, this is a new option to have. And from there, you can find all of the running containers that you can attach to. So in my case, it's not going to find any containers because I don't have any running currently. But if you did, then this is the way to go. And of course, you can also attach to a remote machine and view containers that way. And once you hit attach, you'll be able to debug as usual. So it's currently only available for Linux containers, but we are in the process of adding it for Windows containers as well. And 2 more features to go. So the first one is source link. This is a tool that when you enable it will allow you to attach or sync up your code with any DLLs or binaries that you may not have enlistments for. So if you've ever wanted to debug a NuGet package or something that's out in GitHub or GitLab, then you can use source link, enable it in order to automatically start debugging those. And finally, my team has made an extension available in the marketplace. So if you've ever needed to debug a child process, such as process.start, for instance, then you can use the child process debugging power tool in order to do that. And wow, that was a lot of features. So to wrap up, if you liked this app that I use and want to play around with it some more, here is the link to the master branch, the async branch. That QR code will also take you there as well. Specifically, that QR code is going to take you to the bulleted list of all the features that I talked about in this session. So if you missed a few or if you want to go back and review them, they're all there with links to a relevant blog post or doc. I'm gonna leave there for a few minutes because you're taking pictures. And if you ask, I can always turn this back at the very end as well. Right. And then calls to action. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. That is my contact info. Or contact me about anything, and then I can reach out to the proper source. And finally, share your feedback. A lot of these tools aren't possible without your help. Something like Pinnable Properties really would not have happened without all the feedback that we got about Debugger Display and how cool that is, but then all the drawbacks associated with it. So if you're interested in sharing your thoughts, please take the Pinnable Properties survey since it's our latest feature and it's still a work in progress, and the QR code for that survey is on the right. Otherwise, if you have any other additional problems or suggestions as to how we can make the debugger better or anything in Visual Studio better, there's the link to the developer community. And with that, thank you so much for attending my session. Thank you. Yeah, so I hope each of you learned something new and are that much closer to getting out of the line of frustration and back onto the ride of seeing your code work properly. So I'll be here for a few minutes to answer any questions. Otherwise, I'm also doing booth duty in like the next hour and a half. Thanks.